And welcome to today's Planter Session webinar, Know Your City, brought to you by Geneva Push. My name's Mark Hadley and I'll be your moderator today. Throughout our presentation, we're going to encourage you to interact with our speaker by typing in questions and using the question pane, which you'll find on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be answering questions live straight after the initial interview. The initial interview goes for about 30 minutes, so make sure you get yours in early because often we have lots of questions and it can be hard to sort of get last-minute ideas in. Send them through any time. I'll collect them together and send them on to Al, and he'll feed them to Derek as we go through that question stage. Also, we'll be recording today's session and we'll make the link to the video available 24 hours after the event via email. So you don't really need to worry about missing out. We'll send you an email and let you know how to get hold of it. Now, before we get underway, I'd like to take a chance to thank EA Insurance for actually making this entire webinar possible. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of church planting yet, then we'd recommend you start with a chat with EA. They can help you sort out everything from public liability to building, property and contents insurance, as well as let you know probably about issues you haven't even thought of yet. ea.org.au, best place to start that particular journey. Now, on to our host. Well, Al Stewart is a founding director of Geneva Push, a church planter in his own right, and a man with decades of frontline ministry experience. He'd probably be more comfortable hunting pigs than handling a computer, but he's here to help us all understand our cities, and that make us much better at church planting. Good morning, Al.
Good morning, Mark. Thanks for the intro.
No problems, mate. Well, listen, I'll silence myself and I'll let you go on with the show. Al, basically, I guess you're going to tell us all about our speaker this morning.
Yes, I will, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this morning is Derek Hanna. Derek is the pastor of the Village Church in Brisbane. I'll just say good morning to Derek straight away. Good morning, mate.
Morning, Al.
Hey, good morning. How are things in Brisbane this morning?
Beautiful as always up here in Brisbane. About 28 degrees. Beautiful.
Okay. Righto, and tomorrow it's perfect. Mate, you're the pastor of the Village Church in Brisbane.
Yep.
How would you like to tell us? The story of the Village Church and how long you've been going for? Just give us a kind of the pen portrait of the Village Church.
Yep, sure. So we started about 4.5 years ago. We're a plant out of Mitchelton Presbyterian Church, and we're still connected to them. We're a kind of satellite congregation from them. So we started about 4.5 years ago out of an evening congregation called Lake Church, young adults, and that had grown to the point where we thought we should plant, and we looked at a number of places around to plant. A lot of people live towards the city on the other side of the river in Brisbane as well. So we tried a number of places. We ended up trying a lecture theatre in a QUT, Kelvin Grove, so the uni about 1.5 k's from the city, and so called Kelvin Grove. It was a place undergoing urban renewal, university kind of village as well. So there's a lot of change going on there. We tried planting in there, or tried a service in there, and it fit really well. So that was about 4.5 years ago. Kelvin Grove's a really easy place to get into. It's experiencing a lot of growth at the moment through a crossroads for roads, so people find it easy to get there. And I suppose with Village Church, we've just had the privilege of being exposed to a whole number of different groups, so university students, a lot of international students, so that's kind of the story of Village Church from 4.5 years ago to now.
Okay. What kind of core team did you start with, mate? Did you hand-pick the team that you began with, or was it just kind of the ones who happened to be there, or how did that work?
Yeah, we put it out when we were planning out of Lake Church. We put it out to people who would be interested in heading off to a plant towards the city, and we had about 20, 25 people put their hand up and say they were willing to go. So that formulated the core team. We had probably about 10 people who were on the fringe of that who weren't really connected to Lake Church and decided they wanted something different, so they came along as well. So the core group who planted was about 20 to 30 people, and some lived over the other side of the city, some more towards the city, and some were just keen to reach Kelvin Grove because they'd either gone to uni there or they had a heart for it. So that was how the core team was built.
Okay, so they're the kind of people who just kind of felt like they belonged in that suburb, in that area.
Yep.
Okay. By the way, what's happened family-wise the last 4 or 5 years? You've been growing a church. It looks like you've been growing a family when I see the photos.
Yeah, a couple of boys pop along. So when we started, it was just Sebastian just the one not pulling a face in the middle of the photo there.
Ah, yes, yep.
And he was, I think, well, he must have been 3, I think. So he was the only kid when we started Village Church, and then that same year when we planted, I think, it was the same year we had Elliot, the one on the left, the very attractive face there, and then just last year, last September we had Tristan, the one I'm holding there, so he's a year old now. So when we started with Village Church, we just had, Sebastian there, and now I think we've got 27 kids flying around at Village Church. So he's got a bit of company. It's nice.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You attract people the same age and stage as you are. It just kind of seems like a law of nature. Yeah. All right. Now, mate, you worked at Mitchelton Presbyterian Church for a while. Mitchelton, I've been there once or twice. It's kind of out in suburbia. Kelvin Grove is much more inner city. Can you talk us? We're talking in the sense of know your city. What are the key differences that you've noticed between trying to reach Kelvin Grove and the tribes that live there or congregate there, compared to say Mitchelton, which is suburbia?
Yeah, so Kelvin Grove is very much inner city. So it is quite like, even though Mitchelton's only 8 k's out of the city. It's very much suburbia. So, the area around Kelvin Grove is predominantly units and townhouses, nearly 60, 70, 80% made up. That's where you head out to Mitchelton area, 80+% detached houses. And so it's very much suburbia out there. I think people are a little bit more settled in life out at Mitchelton. They feel like they're in a place where they will be for a long time. So there's not quite that sense of movement, or they feel like they are tied to Mitchelton. Is where a lot of people who live in the inner city, it is a little bit more dynamic in a sense. They don't think they're going to be there forever. They enjoy the fast pace of life. I think for people in Kelvin Grove as well, just in the inner city that we work with, I think the struggles for people are often a little bit more on the surface. Like you can see a little bit more willing to, or you can see the things that people are going through. I think when people have settled into some life in suburbia, it's a little bit harder sometimes to kind of dig beneath that. They feel like they are where they are and they should be happy where they are. As where people, in the inner city, certainly people we deal with at Kelvin Grove and Village Church, it's a little bit more easy to see the struggles that they're having.
Is that even young people, mate? Like, is that, even the 20-somethings? I've got in my head that the people around Kelvin Grove are likely to be kind of 20 to early 30s. Is that, you're saying they have problems they struggle with?
So when I say just identifying those people, so predominantly people that we deal with in Kelvin Grove, although it's not exclusively this group, that kind of young adult, 18 to 35, so uni age and young workers and professionals. And so a little bit more, I suppose they're not quite as settled in life. They're still working through things, wanting more engagement, have a little bit more time, a little bit more disposable income. And so, it is a little bit different.
Okay. What other? Okay, so people aren't quite as adept at hiding the struggles and dramas that they have. What else, mate? What jumps out?
Differences. Oh, look, I think for the people we are often dealing with in the inner city here, that most of them are professionals. In terms of their outlook on life, on money and sex and things like that, most of them are far more willing to engage in things which, probably 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't talk about. They're more open about it. They don't see a problem with it. Sexuality is fluid for a lot of the people that we deal with. They're not ashamed of that either. And so there's a fundamentally different approach to sex and sexuality, I think, in the inner city. I think people are naturally suspicious and cynical that we deal with as well in the inner city. So that kind of shapes how we do evangelism and as well our preaching. But I think people are naturally suspicious of organisations and cynical of authority and institutions, really passionate about justice and causes. And so it's not as if people, engaged with that in Mitchelton when I was working there in the suburbs weren't, but it certainly wasn't the forefront of their mind. I think they had other things on their mind, other focuses.
Yeah, like a mortgage and a Tarago full of kids.
Absolutely.
That pushes your thinking the other way. When you say that the people of Kelvin Grove are cynical and so on of organisations, does that spill over into their attitude to quote the church? Is that particularly the case there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I'm very suspicious of power and authority and people in authority as well. So I think that particularly with the church, rather than kind of throw themselves in, there is a natural suspicion, and so they perhaps don't engage as they might as wholeheartedly with other things a lot of the time. So whereas there might be a social cause or justice or refugees which they wouldn't be cynical about, something they would throw themselves into, the church just is something which, in my experience, they approach with a certain amount of cynicism and suspicion sometimes, just because of the stuff they have seen in the media or so it's not necessarily God as such, it's the institution of the church that they're a little bit kind of wary of as they
Okay. Have you found, are they able to differentiate between the denomination and a local congregation, or is that a level of sophistication people don't see?
I'd say most people that we engage with, denominations are just we very rarely talk about the fact that we're a Presbyterian church. They don't really, when we have to go through procedural stuff, they don't really understand why we're talking about it or what the point of it is. And so we certainly have seen a shift, and certainly my language is most often talking about a community that we are, the body that we are, as opposed to necessarily the denomination that we're a part of. That just holds no kind of impact or authority or sway for them. So certainly my language is more around communities and the commitment that each has to the other within that, while at the same time painting the picture of often having a responsibility to the wider body. But yeah, certainly denominations aren't something that people buy into. So we have people from charismatic backgrounds, charismatic churches, Assemblies of God, Baptists. We have some Presbyterians, some Anglicans, and they wouldn't identify as those things. Often they are either seeking and searching, or they just call themselves Christian. They're quite fluid in that.
Yeah, it seems like if you're under 35 or under 35, denominational loyalty is it's a thing of the past. I don't think it enters anyone's head.
Yeah.
Can I ask then, in terms of in a minute, I'd just like to ask you about how you've shaped your church in response to what you've seen in Kelvin Grove, trying to understand the people that you're trying to reach. Is there a difference? You talked about the way people respond to church and institutions. How do they respond to Jesus? Is Jesus still positive? Is Jesus still, is there still a lot of credit in that, in the tank about Jesus?
Yeah, look, I think there is. I think while they're far more willing to, at least people I have dealt with, far more willing to engage and discuss him and what he teaches, I think moving from that to him being authoritative is probably a hard step. So you get far more currency and far more traction in talking about Jesus rather than the church as such. And people are willing to do that and engage with him, but the movement from him being a curiosity to him being some sort of authority is a big step. It takes a long time. But the idea for him to have any say over your sexuality and not just to advise you is just a massive leap for most of them.
Yes, the movement from good advice to Jesus is Lord. Yeah, this wouldn't be the only social group that's had problems with that, I could say. But yeah, now, mate, in terms of we talk about where we get traction in this. Now you've understood or trying to understand and see this particular group, and this is one group. There'll be many others in Brisbane. How have you adapted the way you've run church, how you look to do evangelism, how you preach? What particular changes have you brought in how have you set up the DNA of Village Church?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things we've gone from pretty early on is the idea of working towards an authenticity just in in everything we do. I think that's been really important to us, that we're not trying to be something other than what we are. And so that flows down into the way in which we do our Sunday gatherings. It flows down to the way in which we approach and think about evangelism. It flows down to the way that that I preach and what I preach about and how I preach and what language I use when I preach. Even to our structures as well that go on during the week, and how much structure we have, why we have that, and how we explain that kind of stuff. I think that the kind of suspicious nature often of institutions and the cynical view of perhaps church or authority, but a real desire as well to be a part of a community, even while sometimes it feels like often sitting on the side and critiquing everything. There is this underlying desire to be part of what God is doing, and a genuine community that loves one another. And so that kind of authenticity is something which we have worked really hard at, asking ourselves, how is it we encourage that and foster that? How is it we don't put up a front? How is it that people can see us in our rawness, but God in His grace as well? Has been something we really work at. So we don't try and be slick. We're not trying to have everything particularly polished. We want to obviously do things well when we do them, but we want to make sure that people see the authentic nature of the gospel in what we do. So that's been something we've worked really hard at. I'm not sure we got it right, but we're working.
Yep. So the alternative to that would be to try and present everything slick. We've totally got our act together. The car park miracle every time you turn up at church, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So a very smick and well presented and beautifully flowing Sunday service. I think that for us would be in some ways a bit of an anathema. Just it's not quite. Not that we don't want to do things well, but when things go wrong in church, that's actually okay. We don't plan for it, but the way in which we talk about ourselves, the rawness in which we talk about life and acknowledging problems, the way in which the people at the front don't try to put on a holy voice or, it's meant to be a natural reflection of both their sinful kind of self, but God's grace in that. As I said, we don't always get it right, but certainly that kind of rawness is something that we want to work at, so that people who walk in or people who are struggling never feel alienated with that.
Yep. Okay. Right. That's an attitude and kind of a humility almost in the way that you run things. What else have you done in terms of how you tailored meetings? What have you aimed to do? What's attractive to this group that you're reaching out to?
Look, I think in terms of how we've gone about our engagement with the community, I think that's been one of the things that have been nice about Village Church, and I think has worked. So we haven't, when we've walked into Kelvin Grove, and some people live there, some people live outside of the area, but one of our thoughts was, how is it that we reach this area, and how is it that we love them? We made a deliberate decision not to reinvent the wheel. So if there were things that were going on within the community, then we wouldn't try and compete with it. We wouldn't, move along the line of saying we think we could do that better, even where it perhaps wasn't being done the way we would like to do it. We decided and made a conscious decision to get alongside the people in the community who are doing it. So there's a community centre, for example, in Kelvin Grove, and they're funded by the council, and they were funded by the uni in part as well. And they were doing some conversational English with a lot of the international students, and they were running a few other things to kind of provide contact and social contact for people in social housing who live around the area. And so rather than us trying to reinvent the wheel on that, we just decided to approach them and say, how is it that we can help out? So we started doing conversational English. We started a community choir where it was made up of church people and people from the community, just in order to build those bridges. And at the same time as getting to know the community, we've got to know people in the community centre as well. And I feel like that in itself has been a helpful way in which to allow them to see the gospel in their life. So.
Yeah, it tells the local people you value what they do, and much clearer. It's also actually less work for the church people.
Yeah.
Kind of
I'm not saying it's a
your
primary
relational
motivation,
value.
but it absolutely was. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So engagement with the community. Anything else that you particularly that you felt has been important in terms of, okay, we've got to get this right if we want to engage with the Kelvin Grovites?
Oh, look, I think in terms of how we've done evangelism as well, I think we have this. I want to be really careful and clear in saying we haven't nailed it. We're a long way from nailing it. But I think some of the approaches we've had to doing evangelism have been to work out ways in which we can honestly and openly engage with our friends without, in an environment that is actually picking their brains and respecting them, showing a little bit of respect towards them and their beliefs, with the underlying assumption that I think people are searching for something. And so we have often, when we've done evangelistic stuff, prefaced it by questionnaires and lunches and allowing people who don't come to church, who are connected with church, to have their say in an environment where they're not going to be shot down and they're not going to be counted in some ways, so that people can actually feel heard. So that's been one of the ways in which we've tried to do evangelism and pre-evangelism in order.
Right. So have you had particular events that you've done that kind of like here's an example of a gospel event?
Yeah. So a few years ago we ran a thing called Rethink, which was a whole series of really lead up to talks. So I think there were 5 weeks that build a case for Christianity from the ground up, and that was just a Sunday event. In some ways, that was just the kind of public part of it. But prior to that, we first of all, in order to get to that point, wanted to ask our friends questions about why they believe what they believe. And so we did a questionnaire, so we did little business cards and asked them to kind of go online and anonymously fill in this questionnaire. But we did it through people at church, so they would hand the cards to their friends, ask them to fill it in, and that would be an avenue in which they could chat to them about it. So that was kind of the first, and then we'd kind of collate that and we'd publish them on a site. We published them on a site with videos we had done with people who were Christians and people who weren't Christians about the questions that we were asking. So questions like, what makes you think there is or there isn't a God? And so we put together these videos of people's thoughts, and so they would go to the site, see the results of the questionnaire and see these videos, and then one of the other things we did with that was I offered people from church, I would buy anyone from church's friend lunch if they would sit with me for half an hour and talk about what they believe, so I could get to know and hear and understand what people were thinking.
Okay. Did you get many takers on that?
Yeah, sadly, I had to take out a second mortgage for that, but that's good, isn't it? I kind of felt encouraged for that. It was really exciting. It was a good environment because people whose workmates, they knew that they weren't going to, I would push back every now and then, but they knew the environment they were walking into. They could just tell me what they thought, and that was okay. Right. I just found that absolutely invaluable because the point wasn't for me necessarily to clearly present the gospel to them in that environment. The point, and my hope, and which turned out to be the case, was that this environment would create an environment where the people from church would be able to discuss what I had discussed with them outside of that in an ongoing way. And,
mate, that's brilliant. It might have cost you a second mortgage, but it sounds like you got your money's worth.
It was worth it, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Look, can I ask, we're going to go to questions from people listening soon. I just have one question here. In Sydney, let me say it a different way. I love Brisbane, okay, I want to say that, in Queensland, but there are some people down here. Yeah, here we go. There are some people down here that see Brisbane as, how could I put it, all sliced white bread or monocultural. In other words, it's all Anglo, etc.
Yeah.
I suspect there's a lot of cross-cultural ministry opportunities in Brisbane. Have you seen that? Because I know we've got to learn how to plant churches cross-culturally.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, look, when I came up here 7 years ago, I'm from Sydney. I grew up in the kind of Hurstville area in Sydney, And that's really multicultural. And I was growing up, it was changing significantly. And even every time I go back there now, it's changed even more. So I was used to having quite a multicultural environment when I came up. And I lived on the north side of Brisbane, around Mitchelton, and very, very monocultural, very Anglo when I came up. The last 7 years, it's changed significantly. Hugely. So depending on what part of Brisbane you live in, it's on the south side. There's large pockets of Asian culture down there. In St Lucia area, there's and down south as well, some large Chinese churches growing, and there's a growing refugee population in various areas as well, and that's becoming a big source of outreach for churches. Where Village Church is in Kelvin Grove, there's a huge international student population. So a large number of those that student population is from the Middle East. So from Iran and Saudi Arabia, the governments sponsor them and they pay for everything for them to come over and stay for 5 to 7 years and get masters and PhDs. And so they're there for a reasonably lengthy period of time. So in 2006, there was only about 0.6%, if you have the census, of people from the Middle East, and now there's 4.1% just in Kelvin Grove there. And so that's 4%. A large, 4%. Wow. So that's kind of huge. So if you walk around Kelvin Grove, see a lot of people in Middle Eastern garb, in the middle of what is often thought of it as kind of, Hicksville and redneck country. It's changing, and so we've had to work out, because that's a big part of what we want to do. In conversational English, we're having a lot of contact with people from the Middle East, and we're starting to think about, well, what would it look like if we're praying towards this, and what would it look like if some of these people came to Christ? Because they're probably not going to come to Village Church. It's just not going to be where they're at. So we have to think about, what do we do for them in terms of building a community where they could meet in a way that's authentic, that will help them witness and share the gospel in a way that's appropriate. And, we're a long way from having the answer to that question, but that's, I suppose, to say it's not quite as monocultural, and we're not as big a rednecks as all the hippies from down south might.
Yeah, and mate, rednecks need the gospel too. So, yeah, my neck's a pretty strong shade of pink anyway. All right. Have you managed to? There's the Middle Eastern people. Have you managed to be able to welcome Asian people into your church? Has that been able to do that? Like how cross-cultural is the Village Church?
Look, it's we would probably say we only have between 10 to 15% of people who aren't from kind of Anglo-European backgrounds. But yeah, we are having an increasing number of Asian students come and join us, and so a lot of them come, spend the first couple of years on the Kelvin Grove campus doing foundational English in order to study after that. So we're seeing a growing number there, but it certainly hasn't been a large part of the people we've seen. Predominantly, we've seen people who are from European backgrounds coming over to study or moving from the country to Brisbane, or people from the Middle East. So I know churches like St Lucia Bible Church, sorry, not St Lucia, that's Union Church, the Chinese Christian Church at St Lucia, Steve Nation and Steve Tran are doing just a fantastic job, and they often have much better contacts in those areas than we do.
Okay. Well, mate, let's go to some questions. Here we go. First question's from Bryce. Given that you came from a suburban culture, do you need to contextualise in terms of your vernacular, fashion, interests? So how much did you need to change from your Tarago and 7 kids and your cardigan when you moved to Kelvin Grove?
Yeah. Look, I think I've always been a bit of a city snob, so that probably helped in some ways. So I grew up in, as I said, down south of Sydney. So it was suburbia where I grew up, and when I moved here, it was kind of suburbia in Mitchelton. But we spent a bit of time in London, right near the centre of the city, and we absolutely loved it. And so I think for my wife and I, we've always kind of had a real heart for the city and the close proximity, the rubbing shoulders of people constantly, the best of breed stuff that comes out of the city. So I'm not a coffee snob. I'm a beer snob, but I like a good coffee and I love a good beer. And so I feel like you find that stuff in the inner city. Certainly the way I speak, I've probably had to modify. I think certainly when I preach, I try to get rid of a little bit of my broad Ocker accent that I think comes in there. But I think more so in the way that I preach, not in how I speak. The arguments that I would use, the tangents that I would be happy to go, that I think I need to go in order to reach the audience that lives in the inner city, the probably more complex arguments, the more nuanced arguments. It's more the way in which I preach as opposed to how I sound.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thanks, mate. Was it the right beer and the right coffee?
Absolutely, that's important.
Yeah. Okay. And the right way of presenting arguments. All right. Yeah, very interesting. Another question. Did you use question from Paul? Did you use any particular tools to get an understanding of your area, or was it much more kind of personal, living there, chatting around, that sort of thing?
Look, I looked on. So I did some research and got some guys who actually know what they're talking about, some town plans and things, to give me some stuff on this when we first started, just what the broad makeup of our of the population was. But the things I did, because Kelvin Grove was changing significantly. So when we first went there 4.5 years ago, there were, even though it was a K.5 from the CBD, there were large blocks of empty land there because they were just beginning to develop it. And now if you go in, there's no empty land at all. Most buildings are kind of 8 stories high, and the population has exploded. So while I used some figures just from council figures and ABS and stuff that my friends who are town planners got me, the way in which I got to know the area was, one, by spending time there. So I used to deliberately go down and have coffee there and work there 1 or 2 mornings a week. I'd have meetings there so I could understand what was going on. And that way I've seen the last 4.5 years, some of the changes have gone there. But the second way is finding local contacts in the community, people who weren't Christians, and getting to know them. So, for example, the people at the community centre, understanding, because they'd been there longer, they knew it better, what they understood about it. So I was getting to know the locals, both in the Islamic community, some of the leaders there, but the community centre and what they were trying to do and what they saw as the struggles and issues. They were the avenues of which I feel like I got a feel for what Kelvin Grove was like and where I was heading.
Did you deliberately go and try and meet community leaders? You talk about the Islamic groups and so on. Did you go and see the local councillors? Did you, etc., or was it just kind of be deliberately random as you wander around?
No, I deliberately sought out the people who were involved in the community centres and who had contacts with that. So the Kelvin Grove has a probably mix of 3 different types of people. Well, maybe 4. There's some very, very rich people who live in Kelvin Grove, and they don't want to have anything to do with anyone else in Kelvin Grove. They're offended that anyone lives near them. Because the area has changed so much. And so there's international students from the Middle East, and so they have community leaders in and of themselves there. Students from Australia who've kind of moved there, and again, they kind of keep to themselves, and you really meet them through university channels. But then there's a fair bit of social housing around Kelvin Grove as well. And so that social housing group has community leaders, and a lot of the centre point for this was the community centre called Communify. So I went through the community centre, Communify, got to know the leaders there, and when I went to community meetings, I got to know the other leaders through that.
Yeah, a great challenge to run a church where those 4 groups are welcome and would interact with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Derek, another question from Dave. Are there any particular books or resources you would recommend that would help understand inner city ministry?
My answer to that is, you probably have a better answer than me. I'm not sure I've read anything that I would put my finger on to say that has been incredibly helpful in terms of inner city ministry.
I mean, if I could suggest, I think it's you can look at the demographics, and that's not too difficult, age and all those demographic profiles. But there's no substitute for just going and being there and wandering around and getting the vibe. Like Toby Neal, the Vine Church in Surrey Hills. Toby just, he's there. He fits in. He's one of them. He knows the place. And I think what you've talked about, that's the way to get to know who's there. Those four groups that you mentioned, see, I had in my head that Kelvin Grove were all, hipsters and into indie music and all that stuff. But, they're just, that doesn't fit all those different groups.
Yeah.
So
it's
being there. Let me see. Now, here's another thing. In his book, another one from Bryce. Trish. Is there any particular difference in the way that you'd approach women's ministry in Kelvin Grove, in the inner city? That's a very good question.
Yeah, it is a good question.
Women's ministry.
So if I can say as a more general thing, I suppose, and pull down to Kelvin Grove, one of the things that we have tried to do at Village Church is allow people space in order to be creative. So be very clear about the vision and the goal and what we're trying to do. And one of an aspect of that was reach Kelvin Grove and love Kelvin Grove and serve them and get to know them. So we've tried to create space in which people can try things and be willing. It's okay to fail. And so within that, we've had a number of women who have identified areas in which they particularly felt they could get to know women. And often the easiest avenues for us has actually been through the international student population, the Middle Eastern women, because a lot of the women from the Middle Eastern families who come over are stuck in their units the whole day, and they find it hard to go out. So a number of the women from Village Church thought, well, this is a great opportunity to serve them and to serve their kids, so they started doing homework club with their kids, and we'd get to know the families through that and the women through that. They would do conversational with English with the women, because often they would have little to no exposure with English-speaking people at all, and it would just be a cycle of them being stuck indoors. So that, I think the answer for us hasn't necessarily been that we have, I certainly haven't come up with any brilliant ideas as to how to reach women within Kelvin Grove, but I would argue that the women within Village Church have understood what we're trying to do, have been passionate about the gospel, have gotten to know Kelvin Grove, and have sought out opportunities for themselves with the support of the rest of the community Village Church in order to reach them. So part of that has just been about creating space and encouragement for people to work out how, with their gifts and the area that they're in, they could do that.
Yeah, kind of clear the decks, give them permission to do what they think they can do. Actually, Joe asked a question about Jackie, your wife. How has your wife found working in Brisbane? What sort of work, I'll put work or ministry, is she involved in herself? So what's her kind of ministry or work looked like in these years?
So a lot of the time is spent chasing after 3 hyperactive boys, but from planning Village Church, so when we worked in Mitchell in the morning, she was obviously involved in the ministry that we were doing there, and the Bible studies and the playground, things like that. But the last 4.5 years has been tough personally for a number of reasons for us, the family. And so she has been working, I think, predominantly at both supporting me and working within Village Church. In the last couple of years, as we've been having a kind of growth spurt with lots and lots of kids, one of the things that she has been thinking about doing and working on is how is it that we can use the situation we're in within Kelvin Grove, which has no kind of preschool or no kind of contact with mothers. She's thinking about how is it that we reach mothers through that. So she has been encouraging women's ministry. She's been working at thinking about how we can do this play group. So it's hard.
Okay. Oh, did you say there's 27 kids or something now in the
there's
church?
27 kids. Yeah.
Brilliant opportunity for outreach to young families and so on. Okay. Now, Bryce asked one more question, just a different tack. In his book Centre Church, Tim Keller speaks about the need for a theological vision as a church planter. Have you created such a vision for Village Church? So we've been talking about Know Your City. What about the kind of the vision that you've cast for Village Church? How have you gone about that?
Yeah, so when we, so at the start, I suppose I'm not sure it's a vision or a mission. We inherited Mitchelton's growing followers of Jesus, which was their kind of aim. I suppose one of the things that we have done is we've, over the last 4.5 years, created our own identity and worked towards what we think are the next steps. Is we have tweaked that towards saying what we want to do is grow Christian communities, grow followers of Jesus in inner city Brisbane. So that's our kind of overall vision. Now, I'm not quite sure if that's a theological vision that you're asking, sorry, Bryce, but our aim is to build these authentic communities that model Jesus within inner city. We have seen a need for Bible teaching, real communities within Brisbane, and so that's our aim, that's our goal and our mission, to replicate ourselves as much as we can, and so. I suppose we've been working on how do you getting the DNA right of that.
Yep.
How do you do it in the inner city? How do you do it authentically and faithfully? And I suppose now we're thinking structurally as well. So as you can encourage people towards that. But that's
okay. Now you mentioned communities, plural. Yep. How many people are you getting along, and how many people would belong to Village Church now? However you want to count it.
Yeah.
Because the next question I'm going to ask you is, can you see the opportunity for the next community to be planted yet? Can you see the next church plant out of Village Church or something yet, or is it still too early?
Yeah. Yep. So numbers-wise, we've got contact. So we've got about 160 people who would call Village Church their home. We'd probably get about 130 adults on a Sunday and probably around 20 kids on a Sunday on average. So it's a bit of a growth spurt recently, but that's the raw kind of figures at the moment. In terms of planning and where we see it doing next, we struggled with this over the last 1.5 years for a number of reasons. One is we have really appreciated the diversity within the congregation of ages. So when we planted, it was quite a small age group. It was 18 to about 30. And it's not as if it's massive now. We're probably 18 to early 40s now. With people having joined us, but there are kids. It's a different dynamic. The community has a different feel. There is that nearly intergenerational connection going on, and so we have, and I think that has actually helped us in a whole number of ways grow and mature. So we've been walking this balance between saying, well, how is it? We want to hold on to that in some sense. We know if we plant a morning congregation, what will happen effectively is the majority of families will move. You'll lose the kids and you'll lose the feel. Now that may be a price that we have to pay in order to plan. But one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is talk to people about this. Talk to people about the fact that we are trying to reflect the gospel in our diversity, and yet it's going to require sacrifices. So I do, in my head, I do know where I'd like to plant next. One of the tricky things for us is we're part of a Presbyterian church, and so we just need to work within our boundaries, and we need to work with other churches who might not have the same vision as us. It's hard to believe that, but look, we're working at how. In my mind, I know exactly where we'd go, and I think it'd be a great spot for us. And I'm hoping within the next 6 months to 1 year that we've started. We're in the process of putting on a second person at the moment, and so that's in some ways building capacity for that.
Yep. That's okay. That's great. Well, that's a mixture of living with patience and urgency at the same time, I guess, isn't
it?
Yeah. Let's give a couple more questions. Craig asks, would you consider a second language service? Is there a call for working in people's heart language?
Look, I'd be more than open to that. I have absolutely no experience in it, which would be my only hesitation with it. I think that would be an interesting way forward. Look, I think if we saw, by the grace of God, growth in the Middle Eastern population, if we saw people coming to Christ in that, then one of the first conversations I think we'd have with them is how do we plan to contextualise church so that you can reach your friends and so that you can grow. And look, I would be more than happy. In fact, I'd be incredibly excited about us planning an Arabic-speaking congregation within Kelvin Grove. I just think that would be a massive step forward. So we have spoken to a couple in Sydney who are in Lakemba with Muslims about what that would look like and what might be best to move forward with that. But yeah, I think that'd be great.
Okay, it would be. Mate, this is our last question from John. The inner city can be very transitory. Has that affected the way you grow and your plans to plant another congregation, or are you hoping to grow through the more settled groups? So are you looking particularly to get people who are going to be long-term in the area, or are you happy to work with the kind of the transitory ones? Has that issue been on the radar for you?
Yeah, look, it has. I suppose as I've reflected on that the last few years, while the young kind of adult population is, geographically not grounded as much as maybe 15 years above them, the drive to move or have to move out of the city isn't quite as great in Brisbane because prices aren't quite as prohibitive. And so we have probably a little more settled population. So even when couples get married and in their mid-20s and they think about buying a house, they don't have to move as far away from Village Church as you might if you bought in Sydney. You got bought in Goldbit in Sydney if you want to actually own your own house. You can't travel back to...
Sydney's crazy at the moment and getting worse. Sydney's getting worse.
Yeah, so it's not quite there with Brisbane yet. So while we do see a turnover, we have kept over the last 4.5 years a good core group. So when we plan again, the place that I've got in mind that I'd like to plan is again young professionals of small families living in a tightly packed area, but a lot of them can afford to live there, and it's a nice area, and my guess is they'll be there for quite a while, and we would be looking to reach them. So while we certainly would get some people who live there and might just live there for 2 or 3 years, my aim would be to build a core group in that that would be there for quite a while.
Okay. Well, Derek, that's thank you for your time, mate. We've got to wrap up now. Can I just ask, if people want to know more about the Village Church, or maybe direct people they know that way, where do they find you? How do we find you on the web? Or
I think it's vc.org.au, I think is the website.
Okay. Or if you just Googled, I guess if you just Google Village Church, Kelvin Grove.
Yeah, we've also planted a church over in Austin, Texas. I've seen a guy named Matt Chandler over there. They've used the same name, so you might come across him.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, it's not Matt Chandler in Brisbane, but he might visit one day. Derek, thanks for your time and your wisdom, mate. I'm going to hand back to Mark Hadley now, who'll wrap up the session.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Derek. Thank you very much, guys, for participating this morning. It's actually been really brilliant, and particularly the questions coming through. There was a while there where I couldn't type fast enough, so sorry, Al, if I kept on sending them through so far. I'd just like to say it's been a pleasure basically being involved, and this is actually the last formal webinar we'll have for this year. But we will have, I believe, a surprise webinar coming up in our next event, and that's what I get to tell you about now. Just in case you haven't heard, you really should have, I hope, by now. Multiply is the major conference that the Geneva Push puts on each year, and it is just a brilliant opportunity for church planners across Australia to come together, to share from each other, to learn great teaching. And this year we have both Ed Stetzer from overseas, a brilliant missiologist who's been with us before and who's returning to give us an insight in particular research that's done on Australian church planting, and of course Andrew Hurd. There are a few people as experienced in church planting in Australia, as Andrew heard, from EV Church on the central coast of New South Wales. And so he'll be helping us lay some theological planks for church planting in Australia. That's the 2nd to the 4th of December. It's being held at MBM Church in Sydney, which is in Rooty Hill, and that is itself another hub of ethnic church planting within Australia. So it's a wonderful chance if you're thinking particularly about cross-cultural church. We've had a lot of talk about that this morning. If you're thinking about that sort of church planting, then it would also be a brilliant opportunity to come in and pick the brains of the team there. We'll be moving on to Multiply very shortly. You can find all the details about Multiply on the Geneva Push website, and you'll find that under Multiply, Geneva Push /Multiply. We'd like to thank you for being involved in the planter sessions this year and Know Your City in particular. And also we'd like to thank EA Insurance, who've made the entire thing possible basically by putting their money where their mouth is. They're very keen on church planting in Australia, and so they've supported this as an exercise in helping you be ready to make the best, break the best ground you can for God. Now, EA Insurance specialise in all sorts of church planting insurance, and so you should be able to contact them and talk to them about all the sorts of problems that you might be facing, or in fact some of the problems you might not even thought of yet. So ea.org.au is the best place to get along to talk to them. Once again, thanks very much for being part of this morning. We'll be sending you an email directly after, a quick message directly after this webinar, asking you to involve yourself quickly in a survey. It's a 3-question survey to help us sharpen the material that we pass on to you. And also you'll receive an email tomorrow providing you links and notifications as to all the events that are coming up, so you won't miss out. If you want to just play back Know Your City, or keep it for notes, or pass it on to somebody else. Once again, we do this because we want you to know that God is very, very keen for growth in Australia and keen to see church planting go forward, and He's provided us tools, so we're providing them to you. Take care, and we look forward to taking part with another church planting session with you sometime in the future.